Well, I think we can go ahead and get started. I see that people have joined. And welcome everyone. I'm Susan Demas. I'm the executive editor of Lincoln Square. And joining me today is Sam Bagenstos. He is a University of Michigan law professor who specializes in civil rights. And he just wrote a great article for us at Lincoln Square. Can we trust the courts to stop Trump's lawlessness? Which is a question I think on everybody's minds. Um, Prior to returning back to the University of Michigan, Sam served as general counsel at both the Department of Health and Human Services and the Office of Management and Budget during the Biden administration. And he was also with the Department of Justice during the Obama administration. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, really happy to be here. Thanks.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and jump in. Just taking the broad view in the United States, we have a system of checks and balances, and that's supposed to stop abuses of power from any one branch. But right now, with the Republican controlled Congress refusing to put the brakes on Trump, are the courts really the last option to stop him?
Well, I think they're the option that is immediately available right now. And so that's why
Okay.
you've seen so many cases be filed against the Trump administration. And we've seen a number of federal district judges jump in and stop a number of the abuses. As those cases go up the appellate ranks, we start to see differences, particularly as we get to the Supreme Court. But right now, with Congress not really doing what it should to stand up for its interests, the courts are the place where people are naturally going.
So we've seen that when judges have been ruling against the Trump administration, whether it's on the DOGE cuts or his deportation policies, that's upset him. He's lashed out at monster judges, and his administration is openly flouting court decisions. And meanwhile, some of his supporters have been calling for impeachment of judges or even violence. And then we have the case right, nearby in Wisconsin, where a judge has been charged, with allegedly obstructing justice with ICE. So this all gets us to where we're at today, and judges are actually talking about forming their own security force because they don't trust U.S. marshals to protect them. Um, when we're considering threats to democracy and the constitutional order, how big a deal is all this?
Yeah, I think it's a very big deal. I think the issue about the U.S. Marshals that you raised, is very, very significant, just as an indication of how bad things have gotten. Right. I mean, the federal judges have relied on the U.S. Marshal Service for decades and decades and decades. There's never been any lack of trust there, and now I think there's a real fear, given the way Donald Trump has politicized the Justice Department, where the U.S. Marshal Service sits, the way Donald Trump has attacked judges himself and encouraged other attacks on judges, the rise of threats physically against judges. We're starting to see a real fear that when judges rule against this president, something might happen to them. And it's part and
Hmm.
parcel of a broader effort that Trump and his administration have engaged in to eliminate all of the checks on his power that might exist, both the external ones like the courts, where they're putting pressure on the courts for
Hmm.
sure, but also the internal ones within the executive branch, where they fired inspectors general while violating
Right.
law, protecting them. They fired the members of the Merit System Protections Board, and the Office of Special Counsel, who are designed to make sure they comply with civil service requirements, firing FBI agents, who were involved in investigations, shutting down the public integrity section of the Justice Department, and on and on and on. We've seen just this effort to eliminate or evade every check that might limit the power of the president.
Right. And it just seems like there's so much that's going on that, what would be a multi-day week story with another administration, it, maybe hits on Twitter for 5 minutes and then we've moved on to the next. So that seems to be one of the assets that Trump has.
I think that's right. I think it's just hard for the human mind to process things coming so fast and so furious, and so I think the trick that the one weird trick that Donald Trump has discovered is that if you move really really fast and do a lot of things and just have no restraint whatsoever with yourself, it gets very hard for people externally to restrain you. And I think we do see again, a number of federal judges trying to step up here. I think the real question is for how long that will last and in what cases. I think there are some obvious cases where I think the judicial remedies will in the end work, and others where they really will not. And we need political organizing and political action, and we need Congress to stand up.
So, if all of this were happening in another country, would we comfortably say that they were moving toward authoritarianism? Um, why does that seem to be so difficult for us to admit that about America? Is it normalcy bias? Is it something else?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is this tendency to normalize everything, right? And that is a big issue. It's true if you talk to specialists in comparative politics or comparative constitutionalism, they say, look, this is American. It's a distinctly American flavor, but it
Right.
certainly looks a lot like what Viktor Orban did in Hungary, or
Hmm.
pick your other examples of eliminating the robust liberal democracy that we would
Hmm.
like to think we have. I think a big part of it is there's a deep belief in America and American exceptionalism. We believe
Right.
institutions are uniquely resilient. And it turns out our institutions depend on people to actually
Mhm.
play their roles and stand up for fundamental values and fundamental constitutional values that might not always serve their immediate partisan interests. And I think we've seen an erosion of that principled approach to democratic constitutionalism in this country.
So, how can people exercise their right and, stand up and show that this is, even if they voted for Trump, this was not what they voted for. We still want the constitutional order and democracy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important for people to make their voices heard. That means, you know, I, going to the dwindling number of town hall meetings that Republican members of Congress are holding. That means, taking steps to find those Republican members of Congress and get them to stand up. But it's not just Republicans, because I think
Hmm.
Democratic members of Congress too are kind of myopically focused on what's the precise poll tested economic message that's
Hmm.
going to win us an election in a year and a half. And that's great, that's important, but we have massive harms that are going on right now and
Hmm.
need to be responded to. And so I think, supporting those folks like, Chris Van Hollen and the members of Congress who are flying down to El Salvador to try to have access to people like Mr. Abrego Garcia,
Hmm.
supporting folks who are actually putting pressure on the administration and getting them to stand up. I think we're about to see this budget reconciliation bill go through Congress. I do not think it's at all a done deal that every piece of this bill is going to get passed as it came out of the House. I think there's a lot more to go, but the reconciliation process is a partisan process. It really depends on getting Republican votes to do the right thing here. One of the things people are not focusing on in that bill, I mean, I focus a lot on Medicaid cuts because I worked at the Department of Health and Human Services.
Right.
I've been an advocate for disability rights and for individuals with health conditions for a long time. Medicaid cuts are going to be devastating, but there's also a massive increase in spending for immigration enforcement in this bill. That would make DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, incredibly flush. I think would double essentially its enforcement budget. And to see that moving forward at the same time you have people being disappeared from the streets, sent to foreign countries without due process, and federal court orders requiring due process, provoking high ranking administration officials to thumb their noses at the courts, and to say, to have people like Marco Rubio saying, I'm never going to tell a court what I'm doing to try to get Abrego Garcia back, even though he's been ordered to facilitate the return of Abrego Garcia. People like Kristi Noem saying Abrego Garcia is never coming back, even though they acknowledge that they sent him overseas erroneously, and they've been ordered by a court to facilitate him coming back. If in this context, Congress
Hmm.
passes a massive increase in DHS's enforcement budget, that just sends a terrible signal of approving this. And I think people need to be pushing back on their Republican members of Congress about that. I don't expect we'll get any Democratic votes for the reconciliation bill. That's not how it's designed. It's a partisan bill.
Hmm.
It requires Republicans in the majority to stand up.
You mentioned that, the administration is just defying court orders. There are several cases that ultimately are going to be decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, which has three justices handpicked by Trump and a very conservative majority. But where will we be as a country if this court rules against Trump, say on birthright citizenship, and his administration says we don't care, and they just keep doing it? What's the enforcement mechanism?
Well, I mean, I think at that point, I think that first of all, the Supreme Court will say that birthright citizenship is part of the 14th Amendment, and that Donald Trump doesn't have the power to override that. There's really no respectable argument to the contrary, although Trump and some of his toadies on the outside have tried to gin one up. So I think they will rule that way. And yeah, then if Trump says, I'm not going to comply with the court's decision here, I think the question is really called. And I think, Justice Kagan in the oral argument a couple of weeks ago was actually basically telegraphing that this might happen, saying, what the Trump administration was arguing was, look, if you're going to rule against us, only rule against us with regard to the particular individuals who brought lawsuits. Don't rule against us in general. And she said, well, that just means you're going to lose case after case after case. And
Hmm.
maybe each individual who wins, you'll let retain their citizenship, but you're not going to ultimately stop trying to eliminate birthright citizenship. And everybody who doesn't have the wherewithal to bring a case is going to be treated as a non-citizen unconstitutionally. I mean, to hear a justice of the Supreme Court from the bench say that to the highest ranking executive branch lawyer was again a notable moment about where we are constitutionally. I don't know
Right.
what, if the Trump administration outright defies the Supreme Court. I'm sure the court will try to do something to enforce its orders, but then we get a test of wills, and the court will
Hmm.
feel, a number of justices on the court will feel like they'll lose their legitimacy if they pick a fight with Trump and lose. It's really going to
Hmm.
be up to our entire political system, going to be up
Hmm.
to people in Congress. And again, I mean, both Republicans and Democrats in Congress have a role to play here, but honestly, it's really the Republicans in Congress who control Congress who need to stand up and say, we're going to draw a line somewhere, and, maybe defying the Supreme Court on a basic question of citizenship that was incorporated in the Constitution in the wake of the Civil War for essential reasons of defining who we are as a country, that we are
Hmm.
a democratic country based in ideals of equality. Maybe that's a point where they'll draw a line. If they don't draw a line there, I mean, I really think it's the moment for mass demonstrations for people to say, look, the political system is not being responsive. We have a president who is defying the best reading of the Constitution confirmed by a conservative court. What we need to take serious action. We need to make our voices heard as a people.
A lot has been written that Chief Justice Roberts is a consummate politician. He's very attuned to which way the political winds are blowing, and he's very concerned about his place in history. Um, but yet, last summer, the court basically gave Trump carte blanche on the immunity question. And so I'm wondering what kind of political calculus, that John Roberts was making, that once you cross that threshold, what's going to stop a future Trump administration from just defying the Supreme Court on whatever it wants?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things going on here. I mean, one is that there are really two sides to John Roberts. He is definitely a consummate politician who is acutely aware of his place in history and really cares about his place in history. That's absolutely right. He also is a person who came up through the Reagan Justice
Right.
Department at a time when one of the centerpieces of the Reagan Justice Department's approach to courts and to the Constitution was to aggrandize executive power. People felt like after Watergate and Nixon, the pendulum had swung too far in favor of Congress and they were going to reassert the power of the president. And we've seen over and over and over again a consistent through line of Chief Justice Roberts's opinions, at least when Republicans have been president, has been to expand the power of the president and the presidency. And I think, that was part of what was going on, was that he was just indulging that side of himself. And I think that's true of a lot of the conservative justices. I think the other thing that's important is everybody thinks, that they can make a deal with Donald Trump, that they can restrain Donald Trump. I mean,
Right.
this is um, I, I thought Josh Marshall, coined a great phrase early on in the Trump phenomenon, the Trump dignity wraith effect. That like, people get close to Donald Trump thinking that Trump will help them achieve the
Hmm.
goals they want to achieve, and that they can work with him, and that at the end of the day, they end up advancing Donald Trump's goals, not necessarily advancing their goals, and losing a bit of their dignity in the process. And I worry that for John Roberts, his place in history, if they don't really change things quickly, and I don't have high expectations in this regard, his place in history will be he's the person who paved the way for Donald Trump to massively aggrandize power and then did nothing effective to stand up to it. A couple of symbolic decisions here and there, but nothing effective. That's the worry. And I think if he cares about his place in history, he needs to turn that around.
Um, I did want to talk to you a little bit on the political realm because, in addition to being a law professor, you did run for the Michigan Supreme Court as a Democrat in 2018. Michigan is one of those states where we do elect judges. Not all states do that. And so you've seen that side of things. And, you dealt with the convention process and interparty politics. So what is your take on how elected Democrats, especially in Congress, have been treating the Trump threat? Have they been effective? Are they scrambling? What would you like to see from them?
I'd like to see less passivity, less of a set of assertions to the Democratic base, and honestly, a bunch of independents out there in the world who are just really upset, and some app state Republicans who are really upset about what's going on in the world. A lot less telling those folks, "Hey, we've got this handled.
Mm,
We're going to handle this with a poll tested message that is designed for the midterms." Um, and a lot more actual action. I think one of the things that we've seen is that the poll testing within the Democratic Party is killing the Democratic Party electorally, and that's the opposite of what folks within the party, elite and establishment, will tell you.
mhm,
But it is obvious that people too often don't think that Democrats are being authentic, that they're telling you what they actually think. I worked in the Obama administration and the Biden administration as a political appointee. I am super proud of the things that we achieved. But, when you get to the point of right now, we have a president who is destroying some of
mhm.
the very bases of our collective self governance, and by which I mean both our democracy and the fruits of that democracy. and there's no standing up for that. There's really very little effective that was done within the budget process, which actually required Democratic votes to push back on this massive refusal to spend money that Congress had appropriated, which is clearly a violation of the
Right.
Constitution. Shutting down of departments. Instead, what we had is, well, let's wait. This isn't an issue that resonates with people. We saw even some kind of pussyfooting around the Abrego Garcia case, where a person was, erroneously disappeared to a torture prison in a foreign country, and the government is refusing to bring him back. And you heard, a lot of senior Democrats say, well, this is just the trap that Donald Trump is laying for us. This is not the right issue. Let's just, let's wait. Let's talk about prescription drugs. I worked on prescription drug affordability,
Hmm.
really important. But, this is a basic due process issue. And the funny thing is that actually, it turns out that the incredibly abusive way that Donald Trump has engaged in his immigration policy has meant that his favorability ratings on immigration have gone down and down and down and down and down.
Hmm.
And so maybe this is a better issue for Democrats than some sort of static issue polling would suggest. And maybe people would respond to actual leadership standing up. There are leaders in the Democratic Party. There are a number of folks who are pushing back, but too often the role of Democrats seems to be, at least their self-appointed role, seems to be to say, well, we have the one strategy, and the one strategy is to talk about the three very narrow issues that we think, based on our issue polling, are going to move voters and will take power back in the next election, and then everything will be fine. And by
Right.
then, a lot's going to be torn down. So I think there's a need for an effective opposition right now.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like in addition to there being vast policy differences between the parties, there's just a difference in the way that they approach issues and messaging. There's so much more emotion on the Republican side, and a lot of it is very negative emotion. It's this is who you should hate, and these people aren't like you, and just trust us, we'll fix everything. Um, Whereas for Democrats, they're like, hey, here is our 200-page plan on how, we can fight climate change, which is a very important issue. But in this day and age where people are just constantly scrolling, they're not going to be reading that. But, if they see these immigrants, they're destroying the country, that's a message that, can penetrate, especially with as much as they say it. Um, and it seems that, that's something that Democrats are kind of fearful of doing, especially with issues where they may not be polling as well, like with immigration. But, I think of a specific example being in Michigan. In the 2022 election, there were tons of anti-trans ads and messaging, and yet Democrats ran the table. Gretchen Whitmer was reelected by 11 points as governor. Democrats took control of the legislature, both chambers, for the first time in 40 years. That messaging didn't penetrate. The inflation message didn't penetrate. People were, the emotional issue of Roe v. Wade being overturned, with J6 being a lot closer in the rearview mirror, and that threat to democracy. Those were messages that resonated, and that was emotion. And then we get a little further on in 2024, where January 6th is further away. We're used to Trump coming back. Roe versus Wade has been gone for a couple years. There have been some workarounds if you go to the right states, but it's not as fresh in people's minds. But Republicans keep hammering on the anti-trans issue, and some people have kind of called that the silver bullet of the election. Chances are there is no one silver bullet, but they certainly did use that as a wedge issue and a way to say, look, you think Donald Trump is radical. These people are radical too. They care about people who are nothing like you. And you should just trust Trump because he'll take care of you. Um, I can't see Democrats doing that. If an issue failed for them in 2022, they would never go back to it in 2024. They run for the hills. And so it seems to be a cultural issue. How do you right the ship? Is it a matter of just needing new leadership, new blood, especially younger voices? Because now we don't really have a lot of time to spare.
We don't. I will say the older I get, the more I think we need younger voices. I used to think that was very ageist, and now as I get older, I see there's a lot of discourse going on in the world that I just don't have the same access to, no matter how I try. And so I think that's important. I think obviously the Democratic Party has a huge problem with communication. Everybody acknowledges that. I think, we were uniquely bad in the Biden administration in telling a story, not just about the concrete things we were doing, although, everybody who loses an election says, well, the problem is we just didn't get our message out. And I mean, that's true, but that's not the only point. I mean, the
Hmm.
point is, if you were to ask, what's the point of the Biden administration? I don't think you could get an answer to that question. I mean, different people would have different views. I'm very proud of a lot of the policy things we did, but I think it's very much focused on the policy papers. I'm a policy wonkish person myself. I like that. But that isn't how you win elections. I think the way you win elections is by telling people a story that connects them to something bigger than them that you can do together with them. And that unfortunately the way Democrats have been running, elections for a long time has been much more isolated issues that seem to
Hmm.
already be, be popular with the electorate. I don't know. I think what you're describing that the Republicans have done is there have been folks within the Republican Party who have decided that they're going to move public opinion.
Hmm.
And, you can't, like, the other side gets a vote in this. It's not like you can just say, well, we're going to move public opinion on equality of people who are transgender. On the other hand, much rather be in the party that is defending a consistent ethic of equality and
Hmm.
treating people fairly, than a party that is attacking or disregarding people based on their identity. And I think that goes for lots of different identities. And I don't think we've been super good at that. I mean, I think we've been very focused on dividing up the electorate, finding just enough folks in the electorate to kind of cobble together a majority, as
Hmm.
opposed to telling a story for all of the American people.
Right. And I like policy too. And I really admired so many of the things that the Biden administration did because, a lot of it was just the things to make things suck a little bit less. I mean, just to be a little crass about it, it's so difficult sometimes to access services like Medicaid, healthcare, um, if you don't make enough money, CHIP, for children, just basic human services. There's a lot of bureaucracy. There's not a lot of communication about how to access those resources. And I know a lot was done to make it easier for people, to cut down on the bureaucracy, which of course is allegedly what Elon Musk is doing with DOGE. But really, it's just haphazard cuts and mass firings and stealing data. Um, and so, I've talked with some folks, who have worked on these initiatives, and I think there was some idea like, well, people will really notice, if this gets rolled back because, it's going to be so much harder on people's lives. But, when we're at the state where, you don't know if you can fly out of the Newark airport because air traffic controllers, aren't showing up, and you're, nervous about your basic safety, the alerts for salmonella aren't going out anymore. I mean, things are being broken so fast that even those like smaller changes, I don't think are, getting on people's radar. And you know, I have grown up for decades and just heard Republicans talk about government is broken, it does not work. And, in any big bureaucracy, things are not going to work, and systems get old and innovations are needed. But it seems like that ethos has really helped Trump because, a lot of people said, sure, everything's broken. What's the worst he can do? And so now, when you're at a point where, people are starting to see, like, wait, hold on, this isn't breaking for other people. This is breaking for me, and I don't like this. Um, they're not hearing what they need from the Democratic Party. And so, while Trump's numbers are going down, you're not seeing Democrats being able to capitalize like they did in 2018 or 2022. And it just seems like there's been this paralysis since the November election. And so I'm wondering if, maybe a big event like Trump's big parade to himself coming up next month that really looks like something that like Hitler or Mussolini would throw. Do you think that big things like that might kind of jolt people's consciousness and be the catalyst so that more people get involved and you see a broader movement? Because it seems that that is so critical right now, with elections being so far away.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think we need these mobilizing moments, and I think that really is a mobilizing moment. I mean, that is a, fundamentally un-American thing that is happening. At least not in the America that I or a lot of other folks I know want to be a part of. And I also, I do want to get back to what you were saying about what the Biden administration did. I said I'm really proud of what we did. We did make the government suck a little less and make things suck a little less. But we did a lot of big things. I mean, so we
Yeah,
cut child poverty in half. We
right.
we had the lowest rate of uninsured people for healthcare in history. And I think there was a political theory, and we did a number of other things too. We got shot
Prescription
in the arm.
drugs.
We lowered the prices of prescription drugs for people on Medicare. All of this is really significant, and it's going to make a huge difference in people's lives. But the thing is, I think that the political theory was that if we do these things, people will see it and people will respond. And it turns out you need to do more than just do good things as a policy matter. And we can disagree, we agree or disagree about particular policies, but I mean, there were huge policy successes that made an enormous difference in people's lives, that saved people's lives, that made people live better lives. And what needs to happen is to be able to tell the story about why what Trump is doing is getting rid of our capacity to save people's lives, to improve people's lives. That we as a country, came together around the 1930s, around the Depression, and said, we don't want a world where everybody's on their own anymore, where everybody is, subject to being exploited by folks in the marketplace, where we can't do big things together. We want a world where we get together and we solve problems, and that's how we got the New Deal. That's how we got things like Medicare and Medicaid and the Great Society. That's how we got the civil rights laws, the labor laws, Social Security, and all of that stuff is being taken down. That's how we got the Food and Drug Administration, which protects our food supply and which helps to protect us against infectious diseases, but also against being exploited by folks who sell us stuff that doesn't work. And
Hmm.
that's all being destroyed right now. We have, measles spreading around the country. We have a significant threat still of bird flu. We have cancer research being canceled, Alzheimer's research being canceled. We have made major breakthroughs in solving the medical problems that kill people at a very young age because of the work that we collectively did to get together to catalyze research. And that's been the public getting together. Private sector folks have participated, often profited very handsomely from it. But
Hmm.
fundamentally, if the National Institutes of Health hadn't been financing this research, we wouldn't have cured the diseases we've cured. We wouldn't be extending people's lives the way we are. And all that's being destroyed. And we need to be
Right.
telling the story too. And all that's being destroyed for what? For what? To help to aggrandize the self-image of a guy who wants to have on his birthday a massive military parade. like we're not in Washington, but we're in some other country that we don't think of as a democracy.
Yeah. And that's absolutely right because, it's not just that these actions are having an impact right now. Killing scientific research like that is going to put us back decades and, open the door for, um, us to lose the mantle of being the hub of innovation. And how we've worked, across borders on things like the COVID vaccine. Those are such critical relationships. Isolationism doesn't work when you're trying to fight cancer. Um, and, that's the world that our children are going to inherit, which is just devastating. And so I really appreciate that, not only do you bring such great, clear-headed analysis to what's going on in our courts, but, as somebody who's worked at the highest levels of government, you really understand how all these things work and how devastating it is for them not to work now. So, Sam, I really hope that you will come back and talk with us because it's just so valuable. And unfortunately, I don't think there will be any shortage of things for us to discuss in the future.
Unfortunately, so. I look forward to the day when we can have a very boring conversation.
That would be great. I would love for us to be able to just go through lines of data and this is how we're able to increase, healthcare access. That would be great. Unfortunately, that's not where we are right now. But thank you everyone for joining us this morning on Lincoln Square. I hope that you will stick around for my Amaze punching up tonight at 5. It's at a new time. And please, again, check out Lincoln Square for Sam's article on the courts. You don't want to miss it. And you can also subscribe to him on Substack. Thank you.
Thanks.